Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Life by Design podcast. On this week's episode, we welcome back one of my all-time favorite humans, Annalie Howling. Annalie is a performance coach and a trauma specialist who works with people to shift their mindset to help them get out of their own way. On this week's episode, we talk about the power of pleasure, your authentic, true self, knowing what you want and your needs, and much, much more. Enjoy the episode. Annalie Howling, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you so much. It's a joy to be back again.
Number 2, and we've only had one other person, but I thoroughly enjoyed our chats online and offline in terms of away from the podcast. So it was a no-brainer to get you back. There's so many different paths we can go down today, which I'm excited for. But for those that don't know about your work and what you do, can you give the guys a 60 to 90 second spiel of who you are and what's got you to where you are today?
Sure. So I'm Annalie Howling. Thank you for that. And I do performance coaching work. So that can be with athletes, corporate athletes, usually very high-end sort of C-suite leadership teams, those sorts of things, to help them move past any blocks where basically you might be having a terrific life on paper, but you're feeling deeply unfulfilled. That's where I specialize. And then outside of that, I'm trauma informed. So I do a technique called EMDR, which is eye movement, to reprocess traumatic events. And that can be anything from sports performers. I work a lot for individuals that have had hugely traumatic events in their life. And then there's a lot of people that think they haven't had trauma, but there's still a block. So I describe it as if you're looking at your future and you're excited about certain things, and there's hopes and dreams, but there's something from your past that's littering that view. That's what we need to work out and get rid of, so that you feel completely at peace and just full of that hope, not like, oh God, but what if that trips me up again in the future? And then outside of that, I have a big social media presence, which is how we connected, where I'm just trying to share authentic nuggets for people that find themselves in a bit of a tough time. And I think that's probably what you and I connected about so well and so beautifully. And I think we're probably going to do again today.
We are. I want to go down the path of authentic in a sec. But as an observer and a fan of your work, I have noticed a lot of chat around connection, loneliness, fulfilling relationships, etc. Why are you so passionate about that area?
So honestly, that's the area that I get the most questions about, and loneliness in particular. And I think there is just this epidemic. Like, we've known about it for ages. We talk about it. I remember seeing a figure where the sort of younger generations are as lonely as the over 70s population, and you don't think about that. You think about a poor granny by a fire on her own, I don't eat alone at Christmas, those sort of ad campaigns, which is obviously heartbreaking. But you don't consider that younger generations are feeling that level of isolation because they're, busy doing the whole human doing thing, but they are. And I'm not just going to be like, oh, boohoo, social media and devices, but I do think there is I think the inner critic, imposter syndrome, being inauthentic, all of this is lying underneath I'm not going to say inability to connect, but the fear of really showing up as ourselves. And I'm 42. I turned 42 last week. So I think I'm in a different life space where I'm just sort of saying everything that's in my mind and not worrying about any repercussions. But there's a big disconnect with people even to themselves, where you don't want to face certain things. And there is always a distraction. And now those distractions are packaged in a little thing that we carry around with us all day long and can just stop us from feeling. So the work that I've been putting out lately around that has been from questions, comments, remarks, and just what I'm seeing. I think there is this longing. There's a real longing for people to be authentically in relationship, whatever that means, friendships, work dynamics, romantic, family systems, things like that. But there is this, feeling of overwhelm and disconnect and just not knowing, I think, and being a bit fearful about how to show up.
A couple of months, maybe it was a month ago, I was listening to Simon Sinek talk about his loneliness. And I found it fascinating, but I also wasn't surprised. And I think it's a lot of people be surprised because he likes Simon Sinek. He's got so many people around him, whatever. But it was really interesting listening to his story around loneliness. And I think I'd be interested in your opinion. With people that are constantly growing and evolving, that can mean that friendships kind of come and go more so because you do grow in different directions. What's your personal experience with that? Has that ever featured? Is it something that you've struggled with, through your own personal evolutions? What's your own experience with connection, authenticity, and loneliness?
So the answer is God, yes, and sometimes in the most horrific ways. So that interview is exceptional for anyone listening. It's It's a Diary of the CEO with Simon Sinek, and he speaks particularly, which I think is really beautiful, about grieving a part of himself that he never had the opportunity to enjoy. So he's late diagnosis ADHD, which I'm sure, again, a lot of your listeners are kind of coming around to as well. And he has realized through understanding that condition better, that that's been one of the main blockers for him not having had a romantic relationship or children or any of those things. And he's like, I think, late 40s, and is reflecting on the life that he never had, and is in a space of sort of loneliness and grief about that. And yeah, you can have all the people around you and be Simon Sinek and all the tools, but it doesn't mean that doesn't suck. That there's like this thing that never happened to you, or you didn't have the opportunity for, and finding out. I'm very spiritual, I know you are, and everything happens for a reason, and you can gain peace with that. But I think there's a really important lesson in not stepping over the reality of those emotions that you're having. And so that's one thing I want to just sort of put into the space for listeners is, roll with the punches, or whatever the sayings are. Like, yeah, fine, but if you're feeling something in that moment, like, let it flow, because otherwise you're depressing it into your system, like you're stacking it in your, if you're not speaking it, you're storing it. I think it's one of mine. Like, so, it's true, you've got to get it out, and then you don't need to carry it around with you. But in my own personal experience, I mean, particularly around my divorce, there were people that just did not show up at all, that I had put, not because, I put loads of time into you, and so therefore you must be there for me. But these were long-term friendships that we traversed various different challenges together and life events, and, been on a fairly similar trajectory maybe. And then perhaps I was one of the first to go, sort of divorcing and separating out and that transition. And mine was like over lockdown as well. And like we had two here and, all the rest of it. And they were not there at all, and that was really hard, because you feel very hurt. And I felt very hurt by that and quite lonely. And then it's reconsidering what maybe your current situation is, and what support do I have, or how can I personally create support for myself if this system or these people aren't there. And I'm not saying they're bad, and I'm not saying they're wrong, because everyone had their own stuff going on. But that was something that was very real for me in that time. And I'm profoundly aware that I act as a mirror. So, when I was making that choice for myself and my daughter, and fundamentally my ex, we get on brilliantly, it was the right choice for our family. Yeah, it's a mirror, and you're triggering to people who are probably not maybe in the best place, either themselves or in the relationship, and they couldn't be with me. But it doesn't mean that didn't really hurt. That sucked for me in that moment.
As an observer again, and having kind of been part of your work for, don't know how long now, 9 months, something like that, I would assume that the identity of a strong female potentially means that you get left out in terms of being checked in, or maybe people reaching out. Is there any truth in that? Is that just a silly assumption that I've made?
Not a silly assumption at all. I think there is maybe, I have had a few people say to me, it's maybe not what they thought because of social media, for example, and the whole Instagram versus reality, because I have to take some accountability here as well in how I have shown up in those dynamics in the past, whereby I think we touched on this last time, but, I worked in very heavy toxic male dynamics in the past, and I perpetuated that situation by fawning, by trying to steer clear of conflict, by hiding parts of myself, and by layering up with armor. And what that armor was anti-vulnerability. So I just did whatever I could do to survive in that situation that was so painful to me. And the way I did that was by being hard on the outside, so and just sort of never breaking, never really showing a great deal of emotion, incredibly skilled. And a lot of your listeners will probably do this when you're feeling ashamed about stuff or things are difficult, of when people go, how are you going? Yeah, how are you? And I just didn't want to talk about myself and shining the light on them. And that's always been a fairly good skill of mine, getting people to talk about themselves. So I've got to take some accountability that I wasn't being fully vulnerable and allowing that connection. Whereas now, in answer to your question, I will really show up If someone asks me how I'm doing or what's going on, I will really tell them where I'm at. And my circle maybe has got a bit smaller because of that. I don't like to filter at all. So with the people that are in my circle, I want to show up so authentically in whatever environment it is, and just be fully myself, and know that my crew around me have absolutely got my back no matter what. And they'll also call me out on my stuff. I think that's really important as well. So yeah, I would say that's a dynamic that shifted. And I'm very happy to take some accountability that being able to be vulnerable and really sharing myself with other people is a huge part of this journey, because I definitely wasn't doing that before.
Upon reflection, what do you think? I mean, vulnerability is the kind of overarching theme there, but on a deeper level, what do you think was preventing you from being as authentic as you could and potentially being vulnerable as well, when you kind of break that down?
Fear, definitely fear. It would have been fear about, I came from a household of violence as a child, went through having a violent father. And that is something that felt very shameful. Like I must have done something. You're told you made me do this and it's your fault, and you're too young to process or understand why not. So for my whole life, I've been bad. I'm a bad girl, I'm a bad person. And then you start growing up and you find yourself in, relationships or dynamics or work environments. And I think I said this last time, like Freud would have had a field day, that I ended up going into very heavily like masculine, quite conflicty construction and property environments to obviously relive my childhood trauma. And, going through all of those things just sort of reminded me, or the coping mechanism, as I say, that I found, that I sought, was to put on these layers of armor to prevent anyone get anywhere near to me, because don't forget, I am bad. So inside me, I'm this horrible, awful girl that made my own father beat the shit out of me as a child. Like I must be awful to make someone do that. Your caregiver that's just naturally so full of love, how awful I must be for that to be making that happen. So you just hide parts of yourself and you find a character that people reward and celebrate. And I was, very young going into these environments and good at my job because I had to be, because there's no falling back on going home for me. There's no like second option. Oh, I'm going to go home for Christmas. Like, no. So, there's like, that's all on you. So I've found solace in work and became very successful at it. I mean, survival, don't get me wrong, that's hence the burning out, but it was absolute survival zone and did very well at that. And so then when you're in the system, you're celebrated for success in inverted commas, and that success is obviously accolades and bonuses and, all this sort of stuff. And it seemed great for a period of time because it was meeting a need for security, which was my own personal safety and security for a period of time. But it didn't serve me longer term. Like I talk about this a lot, the biggest body of work I have had to do and the longest period of time of deconditioning has been about me learning, honestly, how to just talk about how I really feel and actually be myself. And so that fear of presenting a perfect, shiny exterior that never showed emotion and was a chameleon, to be frank. Like it's a term in therapy and trauma, when you as a child you learn how to be a chameleon because it's just much easier to blend into any scenario, and it keeps you safe and connected. So that's absolutely where it came from.
You ever find yourself using Coach Annalie as a protective mechanism still?
It's interesting. Not often. The only time it might happen is, and I imagine you'll get this, is if I'm in an environment where it would be a lot of other coaches and say like you're going on one of the conferences or one of the big retreats or something like that. And I'm just going to name this. I think you'll get it. It can sometimes be too much. Like there's a lot of like, let's do eye gazing, let's connect our energy. Like, oh my God, please God, no. Like it's not really my, you're laughing, so I know that you get it. Like, so it can and there's this special language. I know that they say in Silicon Valley, there's a special language they have, like there's a special language when coaches talk to coaches and like, I just want to honor you and I'm going to hold space for you right now. And I just want, and you're like, oh my God, please no. So I would say maybe I might steer into that a bit just because I'm like, I actually just like, I can't really connect here. So I'll play the game and that's fine, but it's not really for me. But otherwise, no, not really. It's yes, I would do that for my clients only. And I kind of very much go into that process very deeply with them. And outside of that, yeah, I'm still in this place of just peeling back layers of being deeply authentic.
What have you noticed in yourself as some of the bigger layers that you've had to peel away when it comes to your most authentic self and showing up that way more often?
Probably romantic relationship. So, I've been single for a long time, and, allowing someone to do something for me, receiving things like that. I'm a single parent. I run a business, I run my life, I run a house, I run all the stuff, I've got a great life, amazing social life, incredible friends, that because of my family dynamic as well. So, let's add that into the mix. My friends are my family. They are my, security and all of those sorts of things, and have been hugely important in my daughter's upbringing and all of that. So it can feel easier for me to just keep going. Like I describe it sometimes as keeping the car in second gear, like when drove manual, because it's just the thought of stopping, getting out of that vehicle, and almost like handing yourself not over to someone else, but just kind of going, okay, like, I trust you. Let's see where this goes. And then if that doesn't work, which sometimes it doesn't, having to restart that again is like, oh, it's just too exhausting. Like, it's just too exhausting. So it's easier for me to keep my life sort of as I've tuned it quite finely because of the nature of it being busy, which I adore. So that has been a real edge, using coaching language for me, is to be ready to lean into that and just see what might happen. And there's a brilliant, do you know Matthew Hussey? I really like his work. He's great. And he talks about, look, it's anyone could screw you over at any time. And I think this is important in work for anyone listening, romantic relationship, anywhere. The thing that you have to get really comfortable with is that you will be okay no matter what, that your foundations, that your self-care, that you don't self-abandon for that person's needs, you keep your life going. Your life is such that even if it didn't work out in a week, in a month, in 10 years, you will be okay. And that's been a real sort of perspective shift, I would say, for me, like in this new phase of being open to and exploring that. It's because it does bring up stuff, especially when you're so used to being hyper independent.
This new phase that you talk about, what from a identity point of view, and I know you kind of touched on it there, but what have you had to let go of and what have you had to step into?
Being the boss of everything. I think letting go of just constantly driving. I think the car metaphor is probably the best one here. I drive everything in my life, like everything. And I'm a type A, I am. So I come from a commercial background. I have an MBA in economics. Like, I am a type A. So, and I like that. I like having a busy, cool, exciting life. So as I said, that's been probably the biggest change or shift for me, to just go, actually, I can sit in the passenger seat. It's okay. That has been a big shift in this dynamic for me. And changing myself. I'm a very sensitive person. I appreciate I dress as Maleficent most of the time and come off that way, but I'm very soft-hearted, actually. I'm very sensitive. And that's been something that through this huge amount of work that I've done for years now, but also especially sort of when I knew my marriage was in trouble, I invested in such a huge amount of work to try and find something to bring back to the relationship. And that didn't happen. And that was absolutely the right thing for all parties involved. But I found out so much about myself in that relationships and dynamics and everything. I learned so much about needs and receiving and just universal problems, if I'm going to call it that word, but just things that everyone is feeling and facing. And I'm sure you get this. Once you've seen something like that, it just gets revalidated in every conversation. You're like, oh my God, why isn't this information readily available? Like, we're scrolling around on our phones every day and seeing this quote or that quote or red flag this or whatever. And no one said that, this is how everybody's feeling, and nobody feels they can name their needs, and everyone thinks they're taking too long with everything, and no one feels they can take up space. And we're all in this perpetual cycle of not allowing real connection. So that's been a longer period of time, a longer body of work, but that is now showing up where I'm at the moment. And it's been transformative for me.
So receiving and support are two words that have come up a couple of times now. What did you find as the block for you around those, if we're talking intimate or even outside of intimate relationships? What did you, as you've kind of peeled back the layers and allowed yourself to be more open and receptive, what did you find as the personal blocks for you, story or anything that kind of came up in that process?
So one of the first things that I did is a very, very good friend of mine, Nikki Armitage-Foy, owns a company called Electric Woman. It's wonderful. And they run these courses, The Power of Pleasure and Sovereignty and Seduction. And she was like, will you go on one of these? I think she's having a second baby. And she's a good mate of mine, so I didn't really ask too many questions. And anyway, I find myself on this course, basically sort of 15, 20 women. We're all naked at this point, being stroked by an ostrich feather in a studio in Covent Garden at 10 a.m. on a Saturday morning, like sober. And I remember thinking, right, okay, I wasn't really sure this is, it's fine. And I'm not prudish, I'm very open-minded. But it was just that in itself, actually, being truly naked with a group of strangers, and then all of us sharing, call it vulnerabilities, blocks, whatever else. It wasn't so much story for anyone. So there was I think there was about 15 to 20 women in that room, and no one really it wasn't so much story that we were stuck in, but the universal thing, the thing that I took away from this is every single person there said they didn't know how to ask for what they wanted, literally didn't know how to ask for what they wanted. And they felt that they were taking too long or too much space to receive. And I'm not just speaking about sexual pleasure there. So yes, that would be a part of it, I'm taking too long. But the other part was it's as if someone was coming over, I'd think, well, I can't possibly allow myself to receive something unless my house is perfect, but I haven't done something for you first. I need to earn it. It's this concept which is slightly bigger than sex and pleasure, but it's this idea of being worthy exactly as you stand today. I don't need to have made my house this immaculate environment to be desired. I don't need to have ticked everything off my to-do list that no one even knows about in order to be able to create this space to be really present in a deep moment of intimacy with my partner. But we have this narrative, I think mainly as women, where it's this this need to have earned it. I need to have been perfect. I need to look perfect. I need to perform perfectly. And of course, all of that is such a block to pleasure. You can have sex without any, and it can be functional, it can work, but it doesn't mean it was sensual. It doesn't mean there was connection. It doesn't mean it was really focused on pleasure. We can all get off, but it's not. It's a very different thing. And it was such a broad spectrum, but it was shocking to me that every single woman, ages, insane jobs, dynamics, whatever, nobody felt comfortable asking for what they needed. And on the course, they did this exercise. You work with partners. Obviously, we're all girls in this space for certain, safety reasons and things. And one of the ways they did that, an exercise to do it, was to blindfold your partner. And then you spoke your needs directly to them without eye contact. And that was incredible, actually. It was a very impactful exercise in just the practice of being in your moment and asking for your needs alone, and just having that person sit there and receive that even. And although that was entirely sexually focused, and a lot happened that weekend, there was a lot of it progressed from the ostrich feather. It was and I remember sitting there the last day after a lot of progression and a lot of pleasure, and all the stuff had happened, and the group are now so bonded, and we were doing a check-in on the Sunday, and I remember bursting into tears, and I just said, I just don't want to go home. Because I knew that everything had changed. I knew that my marriage couldn't sustain how I was feeling and what I wanted in my life. No one's fault. It just wasn't aligned in that way. And I knew I had to go back and press that button. I knew I had to go back and have that conversation. And I just felt so connected to that group, as you do when you go on any of these kind of transformative retreats. But I remember that very vividly, that feeling that I knew what it meant. That uncovery, I knew I could never go back in that box, if you like. I just couldn't. I had to do this on my own. So coming full circle, going back into sort of a more intimate scenario now with somebody has been really incredible, to show up naming needs consistently, feeling really confident in that. And just being able to fully show up. But I've used that all the time in everything I do now. work scenarios, friendships, and that layer of deep intimacy and vulnerability, although it was entirely sort of, call it pleasure and sensuality focus, showed me so much about myself.
You said that everything changed, and I totally understand what you're talking about when you go to some of those transformative events and like everything just is different. If you put language around that, what changed? Intimacy, connection, like what would you distill that down to if you were to look at that?
I would say I probably didn't, again, I'm taking ownership, I probably didn't have full knowledge of what my needs were, let's say sexually, like across the spectrum, until I maybe had ideas about it. You read a lot of the books, you can have the education and the knowledge. But after that retreat, I had a much clearer idea of exactly the kind of sexual dynamic that I not only needed, but would be the benchmark for myself. I'm very sexually motivated. I've got very high sex drive. I'm very pleasure focused. And that's the difference that I also knew. I remember starkly realizing how different sex was to sensuality and pleasure. And there is a huge difference. It's so different. And here's the thing, like, again, sex can actually be quite impersonal. I'm sure we've all had experiences of that. Like, you don't need to be vulnerable to have sex, really. That can be a, flow and go. But being really pleasure focused and very sensual and, the beautiful act of all of that. And that is a vulnerable place to be in. You have to be really, really open, vulnerable. It's very slow, often like up and down tempo, all of that. But it's a very vulnerable place. And I hadn't allowed myself to be there before. So that was very different, was the understanding that, like most things, I've probably been like rushing through and like whack-a-mole, like, you might, oh, that worked, like brilliant. But it was, it was functional and it ticked a box, but it wasn't the experience that I had now understood was available. And yeah, after that, that was where the no going back.
Well, any of those experiences make it hard to go back, don't they? Whether it's a level of connection, whether it's a level of intimacy, like all of those, you can't unsee that or undo it or unexperience it. So yeah, it definitely becomes the benchmark. What did you find? Again, you've used this word a number of times around kind of allowing, as you, I guess, explore off the back of that and really kind of explore your edges. Again, what did you find come up for you? Because I'm seeing the theme of like resistance and inability to fully surrender, receive, get the support. What did you find, whether it's intimately or even just live, came up for you?
I've got a lot of boys that are my friends. So, I've always kept male friends, especially working in a very male-dominated industry. And I really value male friendship because usually they'll just tell me when I'm being a dick. So it's like men either call you out on stuff in a different way or give you really hardcore advice. Your girlfriends are like, oh, I'm sure it's fine. They're like, no, So I've always cultivated male friendships and I love the dynamic. And I remember going out for dinner with a couple of pals not long after the course. And I was sort of talking to them about it, not all of it, but I was saying, and they were like, oh my God, there is nothing more attractive than a woman that knows what she wants. There is nothing more attractive. And they said, like even in the workplace, not necessarily dating or romantically, they were like, oh God, when you sit down with a woman and she's like, I have what you're having or whatever, and you can see that they're sort of performing and they just said, oh, when a woman sits down and goes, do you know what? I just want a glass of the most beautiful champagne you've got here. And I want 2 desserts and I'm going to have a spoonful of each. They were like, it's just amazing. It's amazing. Like, we love it so much. And my mind was blown. And I had this conversation with 3 or 4 different male friends. And each and every time they were like, oh, it's so refreshing when a woman, and it's this, because you're told not to be too much and don't be bossy. Like bossy is a hair trigger word for me. Like, don't be bossy. And, don't be too much or whatever it is. And so you think that by that simplicity of, I don't want to seem too much, but I really do want to have a glass of champagne. I don't want to, or whatever. And you're like, I'll just go along with it. There's a book behind me on your you'll recognize a few of those as Sex at Dawn up there and some of the others, but there's a book called Pussy, a reclamation up there, which is oh, it's amazing. And in it she talks about like an example of a couple whereby you turn up to dinner on the first day and you're like, what are you having? You go, oh, I'll just have whatever you're having. And like, you sure? Yeah. And then they order a bottle of red wine and you're like, okay, lovely. And then you just go along with that and you don't have dessert even though you really wanted it, and it carries on. And then 7 years later, when you've had so much resentment, which is the poison that you drink expecting the other person to die, you blow up at dinner and you're like, for heaven's sake, Dave, I really want to have something else to drink. And he's like, whoa, but you've always liked red wine. And you're like, you know, so there's it's a really, really great book for like anyone wanting to look around this area. It's fantastic. But it's the really interesting part there is you didn't name your needs in the beginning. And so then, and yes, okay, the person didn't make future inquiries continually, but it's we are responsible for our own pleasure. Like that's a huge takeaway from all of these courses and this learning. Like I am responsible. I know how my body works. I know things I like to have on a night out for dinner. Like I'm 42 years old, you know, like I know what I find pleasurable and what I don't, more importantly. Like if something doesn't feel good, that's also my responsibility to name that, and, you know, all of those sorts of things. So yeah, like, and when you start doing it, not only is, if we're talking sexually or romantically or in any environment, people are like, oh, thank God, like, that's great. Now I know exactly, you know, I want to do something nice for you. Now I know exactly what that looks like and how that feels. There's no resentment building or me just not showing up and being fake. And fundamentally, that's then me denying connection because I'm performing. I'm trying to make myself look perfect for you. I'm being a chameleon. I'm listening to your cues. I'm in hyper arousal. I'm trying to mold and shape myself and present myself to be a version of you that I think is just about acceptable. And maybe I'll let myself come once every 2 months because I feel like the house is clean enough. Like, what the hell? But that's the truth. And there is so many relationships that this is happening all the time. And I hear it here. This is my office. This is my therapy room. Like I hear it in friends and conversations. I certainly hear it when I speak to friends that are second time around, you know, new relationship. And the most important element of all of that is like true friendship and really good intimacy and connection in that area. And all of that is with really open communication. So yeah, that has been really incredible. And it's also taught me, because when you do it and you're validated and it's really positive, you're like, oh, well, I'll do that at work then. I'll just say, no, I'm not doing that. Thank you. Or I actually really need this thing, or that's not going to work for me. And then that's really well received. You're like, oh, I'll try it in my friendships. And you're like, oh gosh, we get on so well when I just say to you, you know what, like me and all my friends who are a bit older, we don't even bother. Like we went to Ibiza a couple of weeks ago and stayed in a villa. No one checked which, we weren't like, oh, let's all get on the same flight and sit together and do everything together. It was like, I'm flying here, you're flying there, we're doing this, that suits me better, I'll leave at this time. Like everyone just is honoring their own needs, and it's fantastic.
I love this. so much in that I'm trying to like bring it all down. At the core of women not voicing their needs, what do you think it is? I mean, if we go back since the start of time, it's almost been this weird, like your ultimate purpose on life is to sacrifice yourself and be the most selfless person. That's the badge that you get when you die. Beyond that unbearable programming, what else do you think is at the core of women not using their voice?
I actually think sometimes it's a sort of weird back to front compliment in that you don't want to hurt someone's feelings. I think that it's quite a difficult thing to say, hey, do you know what, like you trying to rub a genie out the lamp like that isn't getting me anywhere. And you know, looking for change on the back of the sofa, like that's not really. But if you've been in that dynamic for a really long time, and also don't forget, you know, things about your partner, like they're having a really shitty time at work, their parents are unwell, in a long-term romantic relationship, there's very rarely a time when, you know, like there's not saying an issue, but in life someone's not experiencing something. That's like the beauty of relationship, is you're tagging in and tagging out and supporting one another. And that's why I think it's so important to cultivate, you know, Esther Perel talks about like relationship being that we want to know everything about our partner and have deep connection, but the erotic thrives in the unknown, in mystery, that's where the erotic lives. So it's important to cultivate a space for that outside of it. But I do think, honestly, that because there will be a lot of people listening to this and they're not having sex, or they're having not intimate sex, you know, it's functional because it ticks a box, because then it means our marriage is fine because we're having sex once a week or whatever it is, but you're still deeply disconnected and probably not looking each other in the eyes. Like there's I think a lot of the time you don't want to hurt someone's feelings, and it feels difficult. If we've been in this relationship or this system for a long time, how is it now that I'm saying, do you know what, this isn't doing it for me anymore, or I'd like this to change? So I think that's one reason. I don't think it's bad. I think people don't really know how to raise something, especially if there has been a long period of time. And I truly, honestly, from being on that course, from all these books, from every conversation, I also do a lot of work in sexual assault. I think we touched on that before. People do not know, women do not know, sexual assault being obviously very separate to that, but these are people maybe coming to me, and we're going to look at how they want to have a fulfilling sexual relationship after that, and repairing after that. They don't know what their needs are. So there is responsibility. I'm the ultimate girl's girl, and here for the girls, but I want to sort of give some props to the guys. It's difficult feeling your way in the dark, excuse the pun, we're talking about sex, but if somebody isn't telling you anything, and maybe you're getting a bit of a moan or a groan for feedback, it's difficult for you to know. My body is completely different to another woman's. It works in a totally different way. I enjoy different foods. So of course I'm going to enjoy a different touch. And that is the biggest thing you were taught on these courses, is it is your responsibility. Your pleasure is your responsibility. And at first you can almost be a bit like, oh, come on. Well, you're shit if you don't get me off. Really? It's not true. It's important to make sure that you really understand yourself, and you have this really, really strong connection with your own pleasure, your own sexuality, your own sensuality, and your own body, and you can bring that into a partnership. And so for people that are listening that are like, that's great, but I've been with my partner for 25 years and I don't really know how to do that, it's about, I hate to say it, it's communication. It's finding a way to a conduit to be able to encourage this conversation about needs. And there are incredible books out there, and there are ways to start these conversations. And there are counselors and coaches that work with couples that can do that really safely. It doesn't need to feel unsafe. It can be a really incredible conversation. And I think when you can cultivate that kind of intimacy, just even by having those conversations, what can come from there is really, really empowering. But most women were never encouraged to take up that kind of space and even honestly know what their needs might be. And I think a lot of people get to the place where you think, the amount of times I've heard people say, oh, that part of my life is just over. Oh, well. I remember there was a point in my life when I thought, and I was late 30s at the time, and I was like, well, maybe I just have to, I don't know, take up a hobby or something else, or you can't see a way back. You don't see that. And I've heard that said so many times. Oh, I just, I guess that part of my life is just over. I'll just go on holidays, or I'll take up some sort of strange hobby instead. That is where people get to. And that seems linking this all back to authenticity and the inner critic, that seems better. That seems more comfortable in some way than having a conversation with your own partner, usually someone that you share a bed with every night, but you're not sharing, talks or your own needs with. And I'm not belittling it. I lived that life for a period of time. It becomes something sort of bigger than you. And if communication isn't safe, and in my relationship was other stuff, going on, the relationship needed to end. It wasn't just that was a symptom of. But for a lot of people, they're desperately lacking this connection, and it's having this conversation that feels too scary, that's too big of an edge.
That's probably one of my biggest fears, is that exact thought of oh, let's just hang up the boots and spend the next 40 years lying next to each other and gently rubbing each other's genitals every now and then and fall asleep. Gives me so much anxiety as you say that. I don't want to put anyone off in this statement, but I would 100% say that there are blokes, I still encourage women to do this, that will take offense to you speaking your needs from a sexual point of view in particular. There's blokes, I think it's one of the best things that you can possibly do, and there'll be lots that are turned on by it. And unfortunately, and that's communication and conversations for you guys to have, but there will be blokes that somehow take offense to you saying you like it certain way, etc. So don't want to turn you off by having those conversations. I highly recommend them. Yeah. And be mindful.
I would say that is the case. It could be just a couple of things there. Guys often, that might be the first reaction, is what I want to say, because I don't want people to give up hope.
Yes, agreed.
So because when you're in pain and when you're hurting, and especially if you feel like it's a difficult conversation, let's be honest, because in some way someone might be taking on blame for that, or feeling like they're being called out, or they're feeling ashamed. And so possibly the first reaction is going to be defensiveness. Just like if I said to you, you weren't doing particularly well on this quarter in sales, you might be defensive about that as well. But it's the first conversation, and a bit like, deep sea diving, like we just need to keep decompressing a layer down and making it safe and making it safe and making it safe. And you can get to the treasure at the bottom of the ocean. So, or possibly if somebody's hyper defensive about that, like, can you live the next 40 years like you just described? So make a choice. If they're not willing to even talk about it, or it can't be a one-sided dynamic where someone's showing up and willing to have conversations and doing the work in any regard. Like, right. But if you're trying to talk about something intimate and someone's not willing to meet you there at all, there's probably a bigger issue in that dynamic.
Agreed. I could talk to you about this type of subjects for at least 45 hours, but I'm mindful of your time.
Let's run a course.
We should. We really should. If people want to find out more about you, the work that you do, where is the best spot for them to find you?
Sure. So at Annalie Howling on Instagram is the biggest network. I actually just launched YouTube, which is also Annalie Howling, and there's going to be a lot of videos going up, including why sex with your toxic ex feels better and the attachment theory behind it. There's going to be a lot on that. So there's been much more information, the science behind it, the physiology, which again makes communication easier. I've got TikTok at Annalie Howling, and then my website is annaliehowling.com, where people can book sessions, and launching a program so that people can do self-work, self-study, and pleasure is a big foundational element of that. Completely private, people do it themselves. It's a video and coursework, and that's coming out in September.
Beautiful. Good to chat again.
You too, darling.